In a world of information overload, in a world dominated by biased pay-to-play advertorials, in a world riddled with fraudsters, fakes, and phonies, one voice stands out to provide reliable information to investors, business owners, and busy professionals, unbiased and beholden to no one. This is Financial Poise Radio, the spoken word sister of financialpoise.com, the internet's most trustworthy resource about finance, investing, business, and law.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Financial Poise Radio. I am Christopher Cahill. For who? For what? So responded football player Ricky Watters to a question after a game he played for the Philadelphia Eagles. For the very end of the game, when the result was not in doubt, Watters was sent out for a pass. The ball was delivered toward him. And as three linebackers were converging upon him at a high rate of speed, Mr. Watters batted down the pass. He refused the pass, which is unusual for a football player to do. And he was asked why he would refuse to complete the play. His response was, for who? For what? Being hit by one NFL linebacker is pretty unpleasant, I'm sure. To be hit by three, reserve a catch in a meaningless end of a meaningless game, or maybe it wasn't a meaningless game, but you get the point, led to the question. Well, it's a good question. For who or for what? Financial Poise covers many topics in its many functions. Please look at www.financialpoise.com. But you'll find that the topics are weighted heavily toward financial success, professional success, wealth creation, wealth preservation, wealth expansion. But all of that rests upon the answer to the questions, for who and for what? You do all this. Later on, we'll be interviewing Carrie Rosenbloom, a marriage and family therapist. Ms. Rosenbloom writes a continuing column for Financial Poise, and the column is entitled Lifecycle Management for Business Success. And the individual columns take up different topics. And it is about success at home. So I'd like you to stick around and listen to that. But first, let's talk a little bit about wealth creation, since that's what Financial Poise is weighted toward. A great way for a great first step in the pursuit of wealth creation, traditional first step, has been the purchase of commercial real estate. I'm from Chicago. Now, Chicago used to be the hog butcher of the world. It isn't anymore. Toolmaker, stacker of wheat, none of those things. It's still kind of stormy, husky, brawling, and it's still the city of big shoulders compared to other cities if you just look at people's shoulders. I'm referring to the poetry of Carl Sandburg. Sandburg highlights a lot of things that are no longer true. He does highlight some things that are still true when he highlights the cunning, the planning, and the building of people in Chicago. And what that makes me think of are stories I've heard, and I've heard many of them, of immigrants on the Northwest Side purchasing first a residence and then using that to pledge, as a pledge for financing for commercial real property, and then doing it again, and then doing it again. And by the time the kids are ready for college, the parents who started with nothing are able to pay cash for that college education and then some. So it is a tried and true way to create and preserve wealth. Well, we have another continuing column at Financial Poise, new, but we have several columns in it. The name of the column is Location, 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 and it's about investing in commercial real estate. It is written by, each of the columns is written by Tracy Trieger, the Senior Director of Corporate Strategy at Syndicated Equities, a private equity real estate investment firm. It was also the guest on this show in episode 71 of what used to be called Accredited Investor Markets Radio, but is now called Financial Poise Radio. On that show, Ms. Trieger talked about 1031 like-kind exchanges. 1031 referring to a provision of the Internal Revenue Code, like-kind exchanges being like-kind exchanges of property, including real property, as a way of planning for one's estate and preserving the wealth you gain from investing in real property sheltering it from taxes, at least for a period of time. So, Ms. Trieger has consented to write articles for Financial Poise. One of them is entitled, "There's Plenty of Risk and Potential Reward When Investing in Commercial Real Estate." Well, yeah. But you know, the funny thing about real estate, you know that buying low and selling high is a good thing, but you also understand that buying low in real estate can also be a way to waste money. In the article I just referred to, Ms. Trieger focuses on the factors of location, tenant, and financing. So, get your mind right a little bit about investing in commercial real property, which is a traditional way in which to build wealth. One place to look is in the articles of Tracy Trieger on Financial Poise. Now, buying low and selling high sounds like a reasonable way to go about purchasing equities, purchasing stock market shares. It's funny. The behavioral research shows that individual investors systematically buy high and sell low. That insight and others are the subject of an upcoming interview with Larry Swedroe, the Director of Research for BAM Alliance of Registered Investment Advisors. I assure you it'll be a very interesting show about how you can go wrong, and very often do, as an individual investor picking stocks. You end up doing absurd things like buying high and selling low. That's one of a two-part series of interviews with Mr. Swedroe. The second one talks about the nature of buying low, among other things, because he will talk in that episode about 5 different investment factors, one of which is value. Value investing is the practice of buying low-priced shares on the assumption that you have an enhanced potential upside from buying them. Well, yes. But there are other factors that are also important in a properly balanced portfolio, and I urge you to listen to Mr. Swedroe to illustrate at least that mode of analysis. Plus, as a bonus, Larry Swedroe has a brilliantly warm and interesting Bronx accent. So I recommend those episodes to you, and they're coming up in the coming weeks. Speaking again of buying low and selling high, I refer to 2 headlines in the Wall Street Journal. On May 23rd, the Wall Street Journal headline was, "Investors Pull Out of Europe," meaning there's lower investment interest in Europe. The amount of investment in European shares of public stocks has decreased because the returns have become very, very low. In an era of negative interest rates in some parts of Europe and very low interest rates otherwise, there simply isn't much economic growth going on in Europe. Well, okay, maybe that's an opportunity. And on May 28th, 29th, Jason Zweig, the author of the Intelligent Investor column, wrote an article whose title was, "Hold Your Nose and Buy Europe." Maybe he's saying buy low and sell high. Well, he goes into a little more detail than that, and one thing he points out is that the average price-to-book value of European stocks has usually been about 25% below that of U.S. stocks. As of April 30th, 2016, it is 40% lower. So, here's the price of European equities is at a, maybe not a historical low, but at a notable low. Again, this is a value investment play that is presented to us, and that Mr. Zweig apparently endorses, but I urge you to read the articles and not listen to what I say about the article if you wish to get the true story from Mr. Zweig. But again, I will say that it takes a Larry Swedroe or somebody else with that level of attention to scholarly research in finance and with recent market trends. Evidently, Jason Zweig is advocating that you buy low in the hopes of selling high. But once again, if you do a value play, to use the terminology of Mr. Swedroe, you should bear in mind the other factors as well. It's not simply a matter of buying low and you're going to succeed. No, things need to be done in conjunction with awareness of other factors and how they bear upon the market and your ability to gain greater than you would otherwise by being a passive investor. So let's get to the interview with Ms. Rosenbloom. Carrie Rosenbloom is co-founder and partner in the Family Mediation Group, LLC, and co-founder and partner in CT Relational Therapy, LLC. Carrie has a background in law and a deep interest in human relationships. She began her career as an assistant state's attorney in Cook County, Illinois, which is where I reside, primarily serving the Narcotics Bureau, Chicago's busiest department. I say here that I've never had any contact with the Narcotics Bureau. Skipping over some very interesting aspects of Ms. Rosenbloom's career, we can say that more recently, she counsels, among others, couples going through divorce. In 2009, the Rosenblooms moved east to Connecticut, and Carrie co-founded the two practice groups named above. Also, Ms. Rosenbloom shares what she has learned in her Financial Poise column, Lifecycle Management for Business Success, which is found at www.financialpoise.com. It's good to have you with us, Carrie.
It's nice to be here, Chris.
All right. So, Carrie, you've prosecuted criminals and you counsel divorcing people. I must say you have spent a lot of time with people at their worst. So let's start from the extreme and see if it illuminates the essentials. In one of your articles, you explain, quote, reactivity, end quote. It's a term of art for you, reactivity. The article begins with a question. Does your blood boil when you have to deal with certain people? I got to say the answer is yes. So what is reactivity and how does it reflect a limited and limiting way of dealing?
Well, it's interesting that you run it through sort of the lens of prosecuting criminals and counseling divorcing people, because as you said, when the question is, do certain people make your blood boil? The answer is yes, even if you aren't divorcing or being prosecuted. So reactivity is kind of a natural way of interacting when we are triggered. And when I talk about reactivity, what I'm really talking about is that process when somebody gets under your skin and you almost lose all intellectual capacity and you become sort of a conduit for this flooding of an emotional response. And so when somebody triggers you and your brain shuts down, you become reactive. And the cycle of reactivity gets to be, in a way, toxic in that the more reactive one person becomes, the more reactive the other person becomes, and it escalates and escalates so that you never really get where you're going. You just get into the process of sort of unloading all that you're thinking and feeling in a way that is not very productive. So it's, by definition, it is a limited and limiting way of dealing because you've lost all brain capacity and you're strictly operating through a very untethered emotional response.
I seem to remember back when I had a New Yorker subscription that one of the regular drawings that they had, the comedic drawings they had, the cartoons, was of an unhappily married couple, very starkly drawn. And one of them had a speech balloon over one that was just a black field, and the other one had a speech balloon over the other that was just a white field. And I couldn't help thinking of that when you were talking about reactivity, especially over time for an intense relationship like that.
Sure. Well, when you're looking at it in terms of a divorced couple, and really in almost any interaction, I think in a lot of ways the trigger that leads people to be more reactive than, say, the more thoughtful and intellectual approach of responsiveness is people don't feel like they're being heard. And so when you don't feel like being heard, not necessarily your words, but your meaning or your needs being met is really more directly to the point, then, you become sort of a dark cloud of anger and frustration floating into the abyss of somebody who's just not gathering your meaning. So, for example, in my divorce mediation practice, when I get that reactivity or that intensity rise in the room, one of the things I really try to do to reduce that reactivity is to try to get the message across of what somebody wants heard. Doesn't mean it's going to be agreed with, and it doesn't mean it's going to be accepted, but at least somebody will feel heard and not need to be so reactive. take the emotion out of it. Yeah, I think that cartoon is probably really accurate.
Sounds almost like you're moving from a battle model to a communication model. And I think you began to answer my next question, which is reactivity is the negation of thoughtful response. What goes into a thoughtful response? What kinds of habits should one have if one feels the reactivity rising, to make it more about communication and less about battle?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one of those which is the answer is so much easier said than done. Because truthfully, when you find yourself becoming reactive, it's really hard to stop that moving train. And actually, what really can stop it, which is an answer nobody wants to hear, it's almost like telling somebody who's in a tizzy to relax. That's just not going to happen. But really, in a reactive state, taking a minute, taking a breath, taking space, walking away, stopping the process, removing yourself from the situation. And by that, what you're actually doing is giving yourself time to regain control of your thought process. So when I say take a deep breath, what I really mean is slow your heart rate, slow your blood flow, re-engage your brain. Because once you become reactive, you have completely surrendered your control to the person standing across from you, who is likely the very last person you trust having control over your whole emotional response. So you're almost giving them exactly the wrong thing, the wrong weapon to use against you. So really, I think in a situation when you find yourself reactive is to just stop, re-engage your brain, and if you've got nothing productive to say in that moment, there's really nothing wrong with just saying, I need a minute here. I'm going to have to think about that. I'm not sure I can answer you right now. And wait and re-engage in a time when you can be thoughtful, intellectual, and responsive, and see if you can make forward progress. It's just basically taking control of the conversation back into your hands and out of the hands of the very person that triggers you. I don't know if that makes sense. It's a little bit of an easy answer, but it's really what works.
Well, it sounds as though it would be good to enter a situation like that with a few items on your list, an array of strategies that you might be willing and ready to employ. I couldn't help thinking, though, that back when smoking was respectable, well, you had to reach for your cigarettes, reach for your lighter, get the thing ready, light it up. Maybe that in certain situations was very healthy. If it gave you a time and distraction in which you could gather yourself and not sink into reactivity. I mean, it might shorten your life by 15 years, but at least you wouldn't be reacting.
Well, that's exactly right. And when you think about it, so the idea, you just sort of made me think of a different way of approaching this reactivity response cycle is when you go to smoke a cigarette, you typically always reach for the pack of cigarettes, take the cigarette out. Some people will pat the pack, pat the cigarette, whatever your particular habit is, whether you use matches or whether you use a lighter. Typically, you do the same thing every time. And so when you're entering a conversation with a known person, likely their behavior is predictable and repetitive. So if you think about Thanksgiving dinner, I am sure that for most extended families that get together before Thanksgiving, the individuals involved are really aware of what is going to be the most likely behavior that's going to upset the evening. And maybe there are some side conversations with various alliances that form in various family units about how to deal with it and what to say and what to do and how you're not going to take it and you're not going to let this person hijack the meal. And the bottom line is, whatever it is you're planning for is predictable and repetitive, and probably the responses that you're looking to have in that particular situation are the same ones that have gone on for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years. And the end result will be the exact same.
Okay, so what's the content? I mean, when we see a person who's acting in front of us and we react, I mean, we could see that with our eyes. But are you saying
Sure.
Our thoughtful selves should see a little more, like the context, the system in which the actor is situated, and maybe how that actor is affected by various factors? Instead of just thinking about your reaction, maybe you think more holistically about the context?
I don't know if context really matters, because if you take certain people in certain systems, a family system, an office environment, and you throw in an outside act or an outside event. Maybe someone gets fired. Maybe there's an actual fire. Maybe somebody's on a delayed absence. And you look at the players in that system. Their responses are probably predictable. Somebody takes on extra work. Somebody gets resentful. Somebody calls 911. Somebody freaks out. I mean, typically players are predictable. So when you're talking about reactivity and responsiveness, one of the gifts that we all have, unless, of course, we're rear-ended by a stranger and then we get out of the car screaming, which is an unpredictable, non-normative event, but in the events of our everyday lives, people's behaviors are fairly predictable. So if you are going to have an encounter with somebody who you know and you've had conversations with before and have been repeatedly triggered and repeatedly reactive, then your best tool is to recognize the pattern and figure out how you can interrupt it. Not by doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different response, which we all have come to know as the definition of insanity, but by really thinking, how can I approach this differently? How can I handle this situation, which may at times mean not entering the situation at all, but how can I handle the situation in a way that is likely to elicit a different response? Because once you decompress and once you are no longer an escalating factor, then the person who you are in communication with has no choice but to respond accordingly. So it's sort of a spitting in the wind scenario when somebody finds that they're fighting alone, one hand clapping, whatever metaphor you want to use. Once you become the non-reactive person, then the reactive person in front of you has no choice but to stand down because they're reacting against nothing. So predictability and trying something a little bit different, but actually different, not the same thing in a different way, really reduces the need for reactivity in the first place because you're changing the whole way in which the person who you typically react to responds to you in the first place.
Okay, so there's a systemic view, people as players, and sort of taking a meta view and accordingly adjusting the dynamic. How does that view help one think about parent-child issues, to shift the metaphor? In particular, I'm thinking there's a lot of controversy over helicopter parents. There's definitely more of them now than when I was a kid. There weren't any when I was a kid. But now parents tend very much to impress themselves on all parts of a child's life. So how does a more systemic view help us think about such issues?
So now you're kind of right in my most exciting field, which is really helping this family dynamic support positive growth for children while giving parents appropriate and fulfilling access. So systemically speaking, families are systems, and families have, like systems, a response reaction, which is, in its most simple form, a change in one or an action in one influences the actions in another or in all. So unlike sort of a cause and effect mentality, systemic thinking is more about how one influences the behavior of another. So when you look at the parent-child relationship, the more involved parents are with their children influences the way in which the children respond. And that can come up in a variety of ways. Ideally, you want to influence children to be open and honest and self-assured and moving forward, but sometimes that doesn't happen. So helicoptering in and of itself isn't all evil. It's the way parents are these days. They want a good look, and quite frankly, how are they not going to? They have access to every component of their children's lives. I mean, if it isn't the school putting up every homework assignment and every grade that they've ever had, it's Instagram and Snapchat. I mean, unless your kids go to great measures to block you, you're there and you're going to look. So parents have huge responsibility to manage the amount of information they're given and still support children's autonomy. And that sort of rise to autonomy starts really in adolescence. I mean, it's no mystery why children and adolescents become so kind of outrageous. Sure, there's a hormonal component, but really this is their first time when they're sort of beginning to throw elbows to make space in the world and figure out what life is like when they have a little bit of freedom. Parents' jobs job to create the appropriate pushback so that kids don't get overwhelmed with the independence, but that they recognize that it's safe to express some autonomy and live life alone. And how do you do that when you have parents hovering over your every move? And the way I say is, when parents get information, just take it as information. If you're going to watch over your children, that's fine, but it doesn't mean you have to tell them what you've seen. There's a lot of talk these days about anxious kids. And I look at that as a very sort of dynamic, systemic reaction to all of this helicoptering. For example, when your 13-year-old gets in the car at the end of the day and talks about how horrible lunch was because her friends didn't save her a seat, and suddenly she had to say to people she didn't know, or she had a bad stomach ache and she came home early. And this, for a parent, is really upsetting. You know your child was sad. You saw your child's response to that sadness, and you can tell that it was a tough day. And so what do? We try to fix and fix and fix and fix. And did you sit with so-and-so? And did you tell the teacher? And did you go here? And did you go there and do this and do that? All of these things are things that your child already knows are available and chose to do or not to do. But what we forget to do in that situation is just to say, wow, that must have been a really hard day for you. And what that answer does to our children who have given us access to their lives is to say, you had a hard day, and I can handle it. I, as your parent, can handle it. I'm not going to flip out. I'm not going to get all anxious, and then you don't have to take care of me. I can handle this information. And then the next day when your child gets in the car, instead of saying, did you sit with your friends today? Did they save you a seat? Were you allowed to sit with them? And really focusing on what might have been the worst 20 minutes of your child's 8-hour day, just greet your child with, hi, want to bake cookies? Want a snack? Want to go ice skating? Something that shows your child that there's life beyond the worst moments of his or her day. It kind of makes sense. And then what that says to your child is, not only can my mom or dad handle the tough moments in my life, whether it's a bad grade, whether it's a college rejection, whether it's getting fired from a job, a breakup from a relationship, or middle school teasing, but that my mom recognizes that I am, or my dad recognizes that I am made up of more than just the worst components of my day. So that was a really long answer that ties in sort of reactivity, anxiety, and helicopter parenting, but it's all part of that whole systemic notion of how we all influence each other in a family system.
Well, I'm a practicing attorney, and you've been a practicing attorney. Maybe you practice now, I'm not sure. But as a practicing attorney, your job all day is to solve problems or to anticipate problems. That problem-solving mentality you're telling us is not necessarily the most effective in a different system, the system of parent and child.
Well, it can be if you listen to what your child is asking. If your child's just downloading, then they're not asking you to solve problems, and you're just there to receive. If your child says, what should I do, then that's your invitation to go ahead and brainstorm with your child about problem solving. But no, parents are not always asked to be lawyers. Sometimes they just need to be parents.
You mean there are children who ask you what you should do? That's not my experience.
I don't think we ever give them the chance.
All right, well, we've touched on intense adult relationships, and on parent and child. There are different systems, and I can't help indulging in the following long question. Recently, the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death occurred, very recently. He famously, and this is in As You Like It, Act 2, Scene 7, Shakespeare famously identified the 7 ages of man, and they are, I guess these correspond maybe to different systems: infant, schoolboy, lover, soldier, judge, pantaloon, and old age facing imminent death. I note that Shakespeare omitted father or parent, which is what we were just talking about. And I wonder if he added pantaloon just to stick it to older unmarried men chasing younger women. But anyway, these are different life cycle stages, and it's important to master them as they are rather than some other way.
Certainly. I mean, Shakespeare was onto something that is still relevant very much today. And there are 2 ways of looking at the life cycle stages. Shakespeare's way, forgetting that he excluded women, which they have now been included into life cycle stages, are very individualized. There are also life cycle stages that are really geared toward family functioning, and they follow the same age progression, but basically it's when you marry and form an intimate relationship and partner for life or for long term, and there's a whole stage where you have to sort of master incorporating each other's families, each other's lives, and really becoming a cohesive, functioning, partnered relationship. And once you've mastered that, then you are well equipped to have young children and go through the process of shifting your relationship to incorporate the needs of these young children in your new roles. And then it moves on to families with adolescents, and now families launching their children out into the world, and empty nesting, and later in life, and planning for your retirement and for old age. And the thing about these stages is that, much like the rest of the human behavior that I've talked about, they require a mastery of predictable normative events. And people and families that master those stages go on and do really well. Isn't to say it's carefree and not problematic, but typically move from one stage to the other, having conquered and mastered the required developmental milestones within each one of those stages. But oftentimes, and this is when I see families, whether it's in divorce or whether it's in therapy, they haven't really shifted or adjusted into a new stage. So, for example, there can be a family that is really struggling with two adolescent children. There's a lot of fighting, there's a lot of conflict. The kids are what's usually called rebelling, and the parents are not on the same page. And what I come to understand is that they never really shifted their role with each other and in their marriage when they had these children. So it's easy to fake it during their early years because you just divide tasks. It's very, although a parent with an infant wouldn't say at the time, but it's very easy to sort of divide and conquer a child in infancy. But when they get to adolescence and they start throwing those elbows and pushing the envelope, parents who haven't really adjusted their roles and figured out what their family values are and what their roles as disciplinarian or as communicator or whatever the roles are within that family, if those haven't adjusted into adolescence, then families can really fall apart, and it really tends to show up, or it can show up later when the child won't launch because the parents haven't really connected beyond those early years, and the children are afraid that if they go and leave home, the parents aren't going to make it. And so it really boils down to the need to master each one of those life cycle stages cohesively as a family in order for everybody to progress. So Shakespeare knew what he was talking about.
Well, I'm thinking back to my own child was very small, and it was exactly correct as you put it, I think, that it was divide and conquer, division of labor a lot of the time, and you simply managed this young person, kept an eye on him or her, and attended to everything that person needed, and your job was kind of done. But things do shift, and shift dramatically when it comes to transmitting whatever family values you have, which might come from religion or might come from other things, and dealing with a willful and cognitively very complex child and teenager. It's a totally different context.
Sure. You know, those are the exercises that ought to be done early on in a relationship so that it's solidified and can be adaptable during those later years.
Yeah.
Not always the case.
Right. Well, okay, so that's the family in and of itself, but we know there are other aspects to life besides family that are going on at the same time. And in fact, your Financial Poise column is entitled Lifecycle Management for Business Success. So I was wondering, before we close, whether you could touch on the relationship between home life and activity out in the world, activity in the marketplace, the workplace, the professions, what we do out there and what we do inside our homes.
Sure. I mean, so here's one place when I talk about the predictability of people. The relationship between people in their families and people in the world isn't always the same. I've come across many people, professionally and personally, who are extremely high functioning, responsible, capable, and really successful in their business lives, but return to home and become almost an adolescent, fighting and uncomfortable and just surly. I've had a number of people say to me, if my family could see me in the world, they would have no idea who I am. And so it's to those people where I say, if things are only functioning in one part of your life and not another, then it's time to kind of look at and it all goes right back to that sort of reactivity, sort of time to look at your reactivity and recognize the difference between the way you're able to establish your autonomy in the business life, in the business world, and the way in which you're able to sort of differentiate yourself between you and your boss and your coworkers and your decisions, and able to make those from a very functional, hopefully, functional and calm and responsive mind, and yet in your personal life find yourself lacking that differentiation, and how you can go about separating yourself and recognizing that where one person ends and you begin are two very distinct places, both in your professional life and in your personal life. And oftentimes people have a very hard time with that concept in one arena and a very easy time with that concept in another. But I think whether you're in your intimate relationship, whether you're in friendships, family, the workplace, knowing where you begin and somebody else ends and what your role is and how you are functional within a system is really important work, and it really takes a lot of the energy away from that reactive emotional response and allows you to focus on the intellectual task at hand, which is really getting from A to B in the most productive, most successful, most positive way that you can.
Which involves understanding your own limitations as well as your own powers, right?
Sure. And your own strengths and your own weaknesses and your own responsibility for the decisions you make, good, bad, or otherwise. Definitely.
Well, I think you've taken on some great mountain climbing in your work as a counselor, Ms. Rosenbloom. And thank you very much, Carrie Rosenbloom, for being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We've been talking with Carrie Rosenbloom of the Family Mediation Group and of CT Relational Therapy. For more information on Carrie's enterprises, including her column with Financial Poise, please see her bio and her columns on www.financialpoise.com. Financial Poise also houses this podcast. Financial Poise Radio is produced by Stephanie Strait. Thank you all for listening. Let's do it again sometime soon.
Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe through iTunes or Stitcher, or you can download our app from Libsyn. You can also listen right on our website, www.financialpoise.com. Each week, Financial Poise Radio brings you news and education about finance, investing, business, and law. To see a short written summary of this episode, go to www.financialpoise.com. Financial Poise Radio is a production of Financial Poise Radio Productions, LLC.